yes, my favorite subject of casual conversation, war crimes. Let me tell you all about the war crimes within Fire Emblem Three Houses. Just the playable characters though, or else I'd be endlessly listing off war crimes for villains. But first, what is a war crime? As understood by the Geneva Conventions, the war crime papers, a war crime is categorized as either genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or crimes of aggression. We'll be looking for any war crimes, including crimes against humanity and crimes of aggression. Fortunately, our lovely cast of soon-to-be war criminals have not participated in any genocides, so we are legally allowed to set that aside. After we've criminalized all the characters in Three Houses, we're going to throw a crazy party, but replace the crazy with war crime and the party with ranking. Yeah, a war crime ranking. We'll figure out who our most war crime committer is and who's the loser with the least war crimes. Let's get back to talking more about the types of war crimes. Crimes against humanity is self-evident, but to be thorough, the Geneva Conventions define them as any of the following acts when committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. Any of the following? Wait, I don't want to read all this right now. We'll come back to that later. The second category is war crimes, which will be the bulk of what we'll see. These are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, namely any of the following acts against persons or property protected under the provisions of the relevant Geneva Convention. I know, we'll get to the specific acts shortly. There are three other parts to the war crime definition though. Serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in international armed conflict within the established framework of international law. In the case of an armed conflict not of an international character, any of the following acts committed against persons taking no active part in the hostilities, including members of armed forces who have laid down their arms and those placed orders to combat by sickness, wounds, detention, or any other cause. And other serious violations of the laws and customs applicable in armed conflicts not of an international character, within the established framework of international law. Incredible. What an absolute mouthful. Imagine having to write like this. I would cut off my hands. But there's one other type of war crime, crimes of aggression. This is the final direct quote for this section, I promise. Crime of aggression means the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution by a person in a position effectively to exercise control over or to direct the political or military actions of a state of an act of aggression which, by its character, gravity, and scale, constitutes a manifest violation of the Charter of the United Nations. Done and done. A few notes though before we go into the actual topic and the several any of the following acts bits. Leaders, organizers, instigators, accomplices, just anyone involved that helps to form or enact a plan to commit any war crimes are considered responsible for everything done by anyone as part of that plan. Also, anyone that commits a war crime because they were obeying an order from a superior still shares responsibility, but they do often get a lighter sentence. And speaking of punishment, we won't be speaking about punishment, partly because punishment for war crimes is basically a joke. A country that wins a war is, for all intents and purposes, immune to punishment from war crimes they committed. The ends justify the means, as they say. Anyway, we aren't here to dole out punishments to anime characters, just to poke fun at them for committing war crimes. Don't think too hard about it. Now let's go and implicate some Three Houses characters, starting with crimes of aggression. My understanding of these is that they can only occur for the first instance of aggression against a state or before war is declared. The specifics are hazy and the historical application is even hazier, but since bigger numbers are more fun, we'll go with a rule of before war is declared. Out of the 7 crimes of aggression listed within the Geneva Conventions, we see 3 in Three Houses. All committed, of course, by the only faction, or just person, who declares war in this game, Edelgard and the Empire. You might think that all the war crimes would happen post-time skip, when factions are actually at war, but you would be oh so wrong. Edelgard actually hits us with a crime of aggression in the very first chapter. That of sending by or on behalf of a state of armed bands or mercenaries which carry out acts of armed force against another state. The first enemy you fight, Costas, was hired by Edelgard to attack the house leaders, who just so happened to be vitally important figures within their respective nations. Only a few minutes into the game and Edelgard is already hitting us with war crimes. She's a war crime speedrunner, and you really have to respect that dedication. The next crime of aggression occurs in a chapter we'll see several times. It's called The Flame in the Darkness. The crime of aggression we're looking at is the invasion or attack by the armed force of a state of the territory of another state. A pretty simple one, which occurs because our main enemy here, Solon, is working with Edelgard, making her an accomplice and making this an attack by the Empire on the Church of Saros' territory. I'll get into more details about this chapter and the one after it later on when we start throwing out war crimes like confetti. The next and last crime of aggression occurs in the chapter where the Empire declares war on essentially everyone and attacks the monastery. This one is an attack by the armed forces of a state on the land forces of another state. Slightly different from the last one, but mostly the same. In the interest of making a point though, I'm going to lay this crime of aggression at Hubert's feet. It's the fault of both Hubert and Edelgard, but Hubert is likely responsible for all or at least most of the war crimes Edelgard's committed so far, and most of the ones we'll be covering. This is because of the additional note I mentioned earlier where accomplices in war crimes are also responsible for them. This is why Hubert, Edelgard's right-hand man, would be responsible for this crime, and while Edelgard, who is directly working with Solon, is responsible for the war crimes he commits. Edelgard commits some war crimes herself, but the Slither squad she works with are the ones committing the bulk of the war crimes she's considered responsible for. An additional note though, post-timeskip Edelgard doesn't seem to work directly with the Slither squad anymore, so I don't consider her responsible for their actions after that timeskip. Think of it like one nation isn't responsible for the war crimes of its allies unless they work together to form a plan that resulted in said war crimes. Moving on to crimes against humanity though, which are definitely some of the most heinous war crimes out there since they specifically deal with attacks targeting civilians. Luckily, we only see a handful in Three Houses, and I think you can guess who's committing them. Starting off strong, we have murder and inhumane acts intentionally causing great suffering, performed by our lovely lady Edelgard, of course. Returning back to the chapter I talked about earlier, The Flame in the Darkness, Solon uses magic, poison, or something to drive most of the villagers insane and cause them to attack anyone around them, including their friends and family. I think it's safe to say that getting killed by your child, parent, or best friend causes a fair bit of suffering, probably enough to constitute this war crime. And the murder war crime should be pretty self-explanatory here. Now, if you're an Edelgard lover, simp if you will, and I will, then you may take issue with my claiming Edelgard is an accomplice to Solon's actions. Admittedly, she does say, had I known they planned to do this, I would have stopped it. I'm inclined to believe she isn't lying, but I'm also inclined to believe she's not being perfectly forthright. Just before the fight, she says, "This is horrific. It's even more revolting, more terrible than I expected." Meaning she knew about this plan, but maybe didn't know all the details? I could go back and forth with myself forever about this, but I lean towards her bearing responsibility for Solon's actions. And it gives me a lot more war crimes to work with, which is more interesting. The third crime against humanity is enforced disappearance of people, which for us just means kidnapping civilians. This one I'm going to label as Yuritsa's war crime, or the Death Knight for the Unenlightened, since he carries out this war crime and is responsible for it. But of course, Edelgard is also responsible, as the one who ordered it to be carried out, and most likely Hubert as well for helping form the plan. I don't have to jump through any hoops to explain this one though, since Blaine and Monica are obviously kidnapped by the Death Knight, and Edelgard obviously ordered it. There's not really any ambiguity there. But our last category of war crimes is the largest. We have 18 different, mostly, war crimes to talk about here. There are a lot more than 18 other war crimes committed, but I don't want to edit an hour-long video going over every individual crime committed. And on a similar point, to save time, I'm going to go through a single chapter that has several war crimes and get through all of this a little quicker. This chapter is the one after The Flame in the Darkness. And this chapter, several students of the academy, civilians if you would, are captured by the Slither squad and forcibly transformed into monsters. And that is technically all I need to say to have all the war crimes from this chapter covered. First is torture or inhuman treatment, including biological experiments, and this is arguably a biological experiment. But if you want to talk semantics with me, then we can at least agree that this is definitely inhuman treatment. There is another war crime that has to do with experimentation though, so let's cover that now. It is subjecting persons who are in the power of an adverse party to physical mutilation or scientific experiments of any kind, which are neither justified by the medical, dental, or hospital treatment of the person concerned, nor carried out in his or her best interest, and which cause death or seriously endanger the health of such person or persons. A bit of a mouthful. I have to admit that I'm no dentist, so I can't say for sure if transforming someone into a monster is a valid solution to cavities or not. I'm gonna guess it isn't though, but you should ask your doctor about monstrification today. And yeah, this looks like it's definitely physical mutilation. I think physical mutilation is supposed to refer to not quite this, but it seems fair to apply it here. And considering seriously endanger the health of such a person is a massive understatement, We've said enough here. This transformation process is clearly incredibly painful, which is exactly why this also reflects the war crime of willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health. I guess I should tell you who is actually committing all these war crimes though. The war crimes within this chapter are all carried out by Kranya, who's disguised as Monica, but neither are playable in Three Houses. Just as before with Solon though, Edelgard is working directly with Kronya, so yes, more war crimes to lay at Edelgard's feet, and probably Hubert too. That's the chapter, but let me very quickly throw out 4 other war crimes similar to others we've seen. They're all from the Flame in the Darkness chapter we've talked about a few times, beginning with willful killing and intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population or individual civilians not taking direct part in hostilities. This shouldn't need elaboration, so let me talk about the 3rd war crime in this chapter, employing poison or poisoned weapons. The beginning of the chapter tells us the people of the town are having strange symptoms. Manuela is convinced the cause is dark magic instead of a disease, but I would say that the technical cause doesn't really matter since the result is one very similar to poison. I'd fabricate some counter arguments, but if you take the spirit of the regulation, it should apply here. Lastly, attacking or bombarding, by whatever means, towns, villages, dwellings, or buildings which are undefended and which are not military objectives. Easy, this is an undefended town with no military objectives. Solon also tells us that he could have done this anywhere, meaning there was no specific military objective giving them a reason to attack the town. Now we have Edelgard's final 2 war crimes. These are taking of hostages, something we've basically already talked about, and utilizing the presence of a civilian to render certain points, areas, or military forces immune from military operations. The hostage war crime is the same example we talked about earlier with the Death Knight, so we can just move on. Using civilians to safeguard positions is actually our first war crime post-time skip. Yeah, all of the war crimes I've mentioned so far were committed before any war was actually declared. Pretty impressive, honestly. But this last one occurs when Claude's army reaches the imperial capital and Edelgard decides to keep her citizens from evacuating. We can't say with complete certainty whether she prevented them from evacuating or not, but there's something else that keeps this war crime at a maybe for me. Claude outright tells us she's using her citizens as shields, but Claude isn't the war crime expert. I am. It was in no way common for the civilians of a nation to evacuate their nation's most protected location the second an army approaches towards them. To say that Edelgard is using her citizens as shields is to ignore the situation that they're in. If they evacuated, they would risk losing everything they built in the city. Instead of making a point about using citizens as shields, Claude accidentally makes a point about the tragedy of war and the cost it imposes on citizens that must live through it and hope their nation wins so they don't have to bear the potential burden of a conquered people. So, maybe, right? We were talking about war crime. Yeah, like maybe this counts as a war crime, maybe not. That seems good to me. I'm so glad you agree too, and if you don't, that's cool because I've already decided you agree with me, so let's just keep this train going. Now departing Edelgard Station. Now departing Edelgard Station. And now on to the rest of the cast, with our first stop being Byleth, who is definitely a serial killer. That flat, emotionless face really just screams, if you died in front of me, I would keep walking because I really can't be late to work. Which, I mean, that's probably fair. I mean, I would likely do that too. Wait. Does that make me... But what Byleth's face should scream is, I'm a war criminal who uses children in warfare, because that is their war crime. Unfortunately for us, the age restriction in the Geneva Conventions is anyone under 15, which means almost the entire cast is legal. There are several countries that have it set to 18, which should probably be the standard, but sadly we're going by the Geneva Convention's rules. In which case, Cyril is our only character who is ever under 15. And only for 2 chapters. The next question would be if either of those chapters involve international armed conflict, but since I've already spoiled the results, we can skip a few steps. The second chapter Cyril can be used in is the same one where we first have an armed conflict with enemies under the authority of the Empire. So if Byleth were to field Cyril, we got him, ladies and gentlemen. Let's put this serial child conscriptor in jail. Although I did technically waste your time, since just recruiting him gave Byleth this war crime. Conscripting or enlisting a child under the age of 15 years into the National Armed Forces. Maybe you could argue that Byleth's class isn't part of the Church's armed forces, but they certainly act like they are. Enough about that though. I've come to the realization that it might be difficult to hit everyone with a war crime. After all, a lot of the students who aren't house leaders don't play big roles that we can slam them with war crimes for. So we need to find a way to hit the entire cast, or at least almost the entire cast, with a single war crime. I refuse to be called a liar because I said your favorite character is a war criminal and it turns out your favorite character is Ignatz or something. I just need someone who commits a war crime that involves everyone recruited. Someone clever and witty, someone who comes up with crazy schemes, someone who likes hanging upside down. Of course, Sedith and Claude too. Yeah, Claude too. Both of them have the genius idea to disguise themselves as enemy soldiers to sneak their way into the impregnable fortress Fort Mercius. Sadly, they forgot to take into account that making improper use of the military insignia and uniform of the enemy, resulting in death or serious personal injury, is a war crime, which means Claude, Sedith, and anyone recruitable in either of those routes is getting hit with this war crime, which amusingly means Edelgard actually gets to dodge a war crime for once. Congratulations. But did their disguises really result in death or serious personal injury? It's not like they stabbed someone while in disguise, but the only reason they were able to get into the fort so easily was because of their disguises, which should mean any deaths or serious injuries are an indirect result of those disguises. My executive decision is to label these as war crimes, but if you disagree, feel free to blast me in the comments or put a well thought out argument tearing apart my logic and making me feel like an idiot. It's too late now though. Everyone but Edelgard, Hubert, Dimitri, Dedu, and Yuritsa all have this war crime now. Thanks Claude and Sedith, you're my heroes. My war crime heroes. But we have more to go. We always do. And this one involves Cyril, our poor little 14-year-old, recruited and forced to kill at such a tender age by the devil spawn Byleth. Our sweet little child Cyril would never be a war criminal, would he? Aside from Claude and Sedith doing him dirty, of course. As it turns out though, Cyril is, in fact, a big ol' stinky war criminal. And not the toe dipping in the pool kind of war criminal, the intentionally launching an attack in the knowledge that such attack will cause incidental loss of life or injury to civilians or damage to civilian objects kind of war criminal. Like off-brand Edelgard. This is all because Cyril simped for the wrong lady, Lady Rhea. Which Catherine did too, because she actually carried out Lady Rhea's order to set the kingdom's capital ablaze with citizens still within the city, while Cyril was an accomplice to the act. Which reminds me that Catherine and Cyril also committing another similar war crime, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects. Well done. If only Rhea were playable too, we'd be able to hit her with so many war crimes. I imagine she'd enjoy this next war crime on the menu though. It's killing or wounding a combatant who, having laid down their arms or having no longer means of defense, has surrendered at discretion. Now this is a spicy one, isn't it? Another one that really feels like a despicable war crime. But who of our lovely war criminals could it be? It's Dimitri. Well, I guess technically Byleth, but I'm hitting both of them with it since Byleth did it and Dimitri deserves it. I know, you need context. This happens when Dimitri is going insano murder style and just can't get enough blood on his hands. He captures an imperial general and does a bit of bullying in the form of threatening to torture him. Byleth steps in and kills the general to stop Dimitri from going too far. The hero Byleth taking the burden of the war crime while his former student gets away. But no, I don't care. I choose to defy fate and give both of them the war crime. Although Dimitri is actually responsible for the crime as well, even though he technically didn't get to commit it. Let me pull out a handy-dandy quote about responsibility for war crimes. Attempts to commit such a crime by taking action that commences its execution by means of a substantial step, but the crime does not occur because of circumstances independent of the person's intentions. All of which fits the bill here. Dimitri was about to kill or even torture the commander before our independent circumstance, Byleth, stopped it. A good Samaritan. Back to incriminating some other people though. Now I have a triple threat for you all. 3 people receiving 3 war crimes, all for essentially the same action. Those 3 people are Alois, Shamir, and Gilbert, and the action is creating forest fires to counterattack an enemy. All of them either came up with the idea, implemented the idea, or were an accomplice to the idea. Not their best moment, especially since they don't have modern firefighting equipment to help them contain the blaze once it's started, which gets them the war crime employing methods of warfare which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. And since the fire is likely to spread to the monastery and cause damage to it, They get both destroying enemy property unless such destruction be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war, and extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and wantonly. Awesome. Look at this trio go. There are actually more people who get this set of war crimes since this specific action takes place once in all 4 routes. We're about at the bottom of my war crime list though, actually the final war crime. Hopefully it won't be too hard to prove this one, something nice and obvious that I won't even need to say a word for. Oh boy, you make my day, Sedith. What a kind man. So those are our war crimes. Let's move on to ranking our criminals. Oh, wait. It would seem I lied to you all. There are some more war crimes. There are always more war crimes. How could I possibly ignore people tossing fireballs at enemies or exploding a cart with a giant firebomb on it? We have to talk about magic and gambits. It's a necessity. But first we need to decide how to dispense war crimes for these. Firstly, which gambits and spells are a war crime to use, and secondly, who should get a war crime for them. I could give a war crime to anyone that has the ability to use illegal spells and gambits, but that seems excessive and unreasonable. And I am anything but excessive and unreasonable. So we will be giving war crimes based on who starts with battalions that can use our illegal gambits, and anyone that is canonically a mage and has the ability to use illegal spells. And by canonically a mage, I mean that they either start as a mage class or are encountered as a mage class when they're an enemy. Simple enough. Now to decide our illegal spells and gambits. For gambits, it's very simple. Anything that uses fire or poison is out, per the blatant war crime regarding poison, and fire is considered almost always a war crime based on methods of warfare which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. This makes blaze, flash fire arrows, raging flames, group flames, resonant flames, poison tactic, and poisoned arrows all war crimes to use. The names really do all the heavy lifting for me. For spells, we can render several illegal with the same logic. Fire, Bolganone, Ragnarok, Meteor, and Miasma all utilize fire or poison. Swarm is a special case since it summons insects to attack. If the insects inject venom, then this is immediately a war crime, no questions asked. Since I'm terrified of insects, I would easily label this as unnecessary suffering, but maybe that's just me. Either way, this one just feels like it should be a war crime, so I'm gonna call it one. Sorry, insect enthusiast, I just don't want to condone sending a swarm of wasps after someone in war. Since I brought up superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering, do you think getting shot with a cannon or other siege weapon would fall into that category? Because both bolting and meteor, one of which we've already made illegal, are essentially magic siege weapons, and using them against a person would be incredibly excessive. These spells aren't referred to as siege weapons in game, but they work the same as the ballistas and catapults. Therefore, I petition that we consider bolting a war crime to use. Any objections? I don't hear any, so I guess we're all in agreement. Fantastic. We have a few left for consideration, but they all potentially fall under the superfluous injury and unnecessary suffering category, so let's talk about all of them at once. Luna, Aura, Hades, Dark Spikes, and Abraxas. I don't really have a good real-world comparison to getting hit with a beam from the heavens, but it certainly looks like it would hurt a lot. All these have pretty intense animations, but aside from the way they look, I don't have a strong argument for their being made illegal. By the way, if you're wondering why Luna made the cut, it's because it looks like a mini, relatively very weak black hole was formed. Maybe I'm the crazy one though, and you don't think getting hit by whatever these are would be so bad. Anyway, since I can't decide for sure on any of these with the information available, I'll just leave these 5 as probable war crimes. And now that we have our list of gambits and spells that are war crimes to use, let's see which evil creatures are using them, starting with battalions and gambits. Edelgard, naturally, who starts Sindred Shadows with a Blaze battalion, and when she rejoins you post-time skip, she has a battalion with Raging Flames. Blaze wasn't enough of a war crime, so she had to step it up. The others are Linhardt, who starts Sindred Shadows with a Group Flames battalion, Yuri with a Blaze battalion, Hanneman, who has a Group Flames battalion when you recruit him, and Happy, also with a Group Flames battalion. As for spells, it turns out every character who is canonically a magic user is also able to use at least one of our war crime spells. This list includes Hubert, Linhardt, Dorothea, Mercedes, Annette, Lysithea, Marianne, Flayn, Hanneman, Manuela, Yuri, Balthus, Constance, and Happy. That's a nice list right there. Whole bunch of beautiful war crimes to keep track of. And for those wondering how people with more than one illegal spell will be scored in the war crime ranking, fear not. I'll just be making the first spell worth 1 point and each after worth a half point. Before we get to the ranking though, I'd like to include a few other war crimes that are worth mentioning but not relevant to our goal today. Firstly, I said there was no need to talk about genocide since none of the characters take part in a genocide, but there was a genocide that happened not long before the beginning of the game, the tragedy of Dusker. This is where the people of the Dusker region were blamed for the brutal assassination of almost the entirety of the Alliance's royal family, and they were slaughtered en masse and their lands were taken from them and ravaged. Not a pretty picture, but one that sets the stage for Dimitri's backstory. Secondly, to bring us back to a more light-hearted tone, is a technicality that any gambit that's capable of moving an enemy is also capable of committing a war crime, but only on a single map, the Valley of Torment. You can shove or fling enemies into fiery floor tiles and cause them to take damage from the burns, which is definitely unnecessary suffering. But it is very niche, and there's only a small chance anyone would actually do it, so I'm leaving it as a random little side note. Finally though, it's time to reveal our ranking. Our list of who is the most war criminal, who just can't get enough superfluous injury or incidental loss of life or injury to civilians. Wow, what a beautiful screen. Edelgard, Hubert, Yuritsa, you've really outdone yourselves. They were at the top of their game in terms of committing war crimes. Their dedication to the craft must be applauded. And I would love it if nobody noticed this, but I was unable to find any war crimes to throw at Dedue. If Dedue is your one true Three Houses love, then I did in fact lie to you. Accept this voucher as my apology. Good for absolutely nothing. You're very welcome. As you can tell though, we have some very obvious winners here, and that rides almost entirely on Edelgard working directly with the Slither squad pre-time skip. This was all done with the most rigorous attention paid to every single detail, so don't even begin to worry that there were any inaccuracies. Anyway, the clear takeaway is that Dedue is objectively best boy, while everyone else are just filthy war criminals. But hey, just pretend you can fix them if you try hard enough and it won't be an issue. To be fair to the cast here though, we didn't establish the Geneva Conventions until we went through 2 brutal world wars. But that's the kind of refusal to learn their lesson that humanity is all about. Before I end the video off though, I have 3 final things for you. An obligatory reminder that war is bad, not good, very sad, murder, don't do. Secondly, thanks for watching, do the like and subscribe thing if you enjoyed. And lastly, now that you've learned so much about war crimes, why don't you let me know what your favorite war crime is in the comments? I must admit to being partial to enlisting children under 15. One day I hope to host a Coliseum tournament of 5-year-olds duking it out with the winner getting some crappy prize kids would like. A year's supply of candy maybe? Anything cheap really. That's all though. Bye!